Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone this afternoon to the Daniels Faculty Lecture, The Building Site Redux with Timothy Hyde. I'm Joseph Clark, an assistant professor of the history of modern architecture in the art history department at University of Toronto. I'm the organizer of the Architectural History Working Group in the department, and we're so excited to be co-sponsoring this event. And so it's my pleasure to moderate this lecture along with Mary Lou Lobsinger, Associate Professor here at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design. So I'll hand it over to Mary Lou.
Hi, hello. Thank you, Joseph. I wish to ask everyone to attend to a land acknowledgement that I will read out. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island and to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis people. We also acknowledge the ancestral lands of the Dish of One Spoon territory and more recently of Treaty 13. Daniels honors Indigenous peoples past, present, and futures here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on these lands. Now, there's a note that I have to read out now to say that we're being live screened and recorded. If you do not wish to be captured, please turn off your video. We ask that you keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. You may add your questions to the chat and directly to a chat, and a note that either Joseph or I will pick up on when we get to the section on question Q&A at the end. So turn off your camera if you don't want to be seen, okay? Okay, it's my honor and a pleasure to introduce Timothy Hyde. Timothy Hyde is a historian of architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, whose research focuses on the political dimensions of architecture from the 18th century to the present, and with a particular attention to relationships of architecture and law. His most recent book is Ugliness and Judgment, which I have right here. And it's signed too by him. Ugliness and Judgment on Architecture in the Public Eye from Princeton University Press, 2019. And he's also the author of Constitutional Modernism, Architecture and Civil Society in Cuba, 1933 to 1959. And that's with University of Minnesota Press in 2012. Hyde is founding member of Aggregate Architecture History Collaborative and is one of the editors of the first aggregate book, Governing by Design. His writings have also appeared in numerous journals, including Perspecta, Log El Coqui, the Journal of Architecture, the Journal of Architectural Education, ARC, Future Interior, Architecture Theory Review, and Thresholds. Hyde has been a MacDowell Colony Fellow, and his work has previously been supported by grants from the Graham Foundation, the Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art, and the Huntley Library. He is currently, this year, 2020-21, the Clark Oakley Fellow at the Clark Institute. Welcome, Timothy. We look forward to this.
Thank you so much. Thank you, sincere thanks, both to Professor Lobsinger and Professor Clark for hosting me this afternoon. Mary Lou and Joseph have been colleagues for many years, and so it's a pleasure to have a chance to talk with you live, of course, but also virtually here. And thanks also to Professor White, for Mason White, for the invitation to speak at Daniels. And thank you all for tuning in this afternoon to listen. My lecture is called The Building Site Redux. In the late 1930s, as the United States endured economic depression, this massive building site in Midtown Manhattan drew daily spectators. Rockefeller Center, an instance of short-sightedness turned into a symbol of optimism, had been conceived at the moment of economic collapse and was now being realized during the fragile recovery. At sidewalk level, the massive building site was a spectacle, attracting the attention of hundreds of the pedestrians moving along the streets of Midtown. Not only passers-by, but also many who gave a more concerted attention, drawn to the scale of the deepening plot, the choreography of the machinery, the exertions and expertise of the laboring bodies. These spectators claimed an expertise of their own. They were skilled in the arts of casual observation and commentary, both of which they directed toward one particular object, the building site. Their persistence and expertise gained them an ironic honorific, the sidewalk superintendents. The story of their recognition at Rockefeller Center, no doubt tailored over time, suggests that John D. Rockefeller Jr., while slowly exploring the perimeter of the building site one day, was brusquely told by a workman to move along. He obeyed in the moment, but subsequently ordered that a viewing platform be constructed overlooking the works. The Sidewalk Superintendents Club was opened on November 7th, 1938. A roofed platform running for 100 feet along the edge of the building site with raised steps inside to enable a crowd several rows deep to look through the framed windows facing the excavations. Membership cards were issued, complete with tongue-in-cheek rules about removing top hats and not dropping children over the fence. A suggestion box was installed, appropriately because the defining characteristic of the sidewalk superintendent was a willingness to offer criticism and praise to the workers on site, judgments on their skill, effort, and performance. This being New York City, an appropriate term was already in common use, kibitzer. The New York Times would call this particular group curbstone kibitzers. Over the next several decades, sidewalk superintending gained something of a cultural currency and was even absorbed into the design of marketing of buildings themselves. It seems that by the 1960s in the US, it was not uncommon to encourage the behavior as a means toward publicity for a new construction. These buttons suggest that there was something of a fad along these lines. The Sidewalk Superintendents Clubs made apparent the fact that building sites could be performances, urban spectacles to be witnessed by the citizens of the metropolis. Here, two passers-by watch an adjacent building site on a closed-circuit TV in the window of the very bank building that is to be replaced. The building site itself is not merely an accumulation of actions. It is an event and an object to be seen, experienced, witnessed from a specific perspective of inquiry. But like any theatrical production, a building site has a run, whether limited or long. It comes to an end. The building site becomes a building. At the end of August 1939, the New York Times announced that, quote, gloom had descended upon more than 60,000 curbstone kibitzers last week with the announcement that the Rockefeller Center Sidewalk Superintendents Club has been closed because the steelwork of the center's final building has reached the level of the street, end quote. Without this hole in the ground to overlook, the clubhouse no longer served its purpose. The club itself, however, could survive, and it did, by removing its attention to a new building site, the construction of the Queens Midtown Tunnel. New membership cards to what was apparently now a nationwide group would be issued with the assumption that the club could proceed from one building site to the next, an itinerant band of curbstone kibitzers. The itinerant existence of the Sidewalk Superintendents Club illuminates a fact that is so obvious that it is rarely remarked in architectural history. The building site is ephemeral. The building site, inescapably essential to the realization of architecture, must inevitably vanish, to be superseded by the more durable forms of the completed building. We, I mean architectural historians and architects, we are accustomed to understanding the completion of a building as a realization, in the sense that the object of our attention has come into presence. But that same moment of completion is also the moment that another object, the building site, has been extinguished. This coincidence of presence and absence is, as I say, an obvious fact, but it is also, I think, a decisive point of disciplinary inflection. Architectural history has, on occasion, examined the remaining traces of a building site in physical marks, in documents, in photographs, for information they might reveal about the realized building. But this is, of course, to see the building site as a means to an end, to see the historical absence as the necessary sacrifice for historical presence. Even in instances where the building no longer survives, the disciplinary instinct is toward this same valuation. A disappeared building is a loss, while a disappeared building site is merely unavoidable. It is both possible and, I would argue, necessary to orient disciplinary attention to the building site in a different way, to regard the building site as a node in networks of exchange and circulation, as the instantiation of material processes of transformation in specific environmental conditions, as the transmutation of physical labor and abstract value, to regard the building site as a nexus of social meaning concealed within any architectural history. But to reveal and also then to represent these dimensions, not just as prelude or as a precondition, but as an independent historical object, architectural history will need to turn to the building site with a different set of tools. Over the past few decades, it is scholars of construction history who have engaged most extensively with the building site as the focus of historical inquiry. The Construction History Society, founded in the UK in 1983, began publishing its journal Construction History shortly thereafter, recently has started annual conferences. From the perspective of the society, construction history has evolved during this time from something like amateur history to a recognized discipline, a transformation that has necessarily entailed scrutiny of what lies within the discipline and the conceptual frameworks it employs. But at the outset, in a statement prefacing the first journal issue, the architectural historian John Summerson argued that construction history could mean either, quote, the history of structural design, or, and this certainly was his preference, the history of building practice. The history of building practice, Summerson wrote, quote, involves the total process of getting a building up on the site, everything including the recruitment of labor, selection of materials, transport of materials and equipment, down to the supply of drawing materials for the office, the method of payment for the builder and architect, and so on and so on and so on. It is the history of a complicated process always in a state of change, which it is the historian's business to investigate, end quote. Subsequent participants in the discourses of the Construction History Society extended Summerson's inquiry into the disciplinary character of construction history, seeking to extend its compass from a core of technological history outward towards cultural history. In other words, either a bigger history or a history in between. The underlying recognition that technology and culture are reciprocal rather than exclusive is not new, nor is the recognition that building construction has both technological and cultural dimensions. But what has been more difficult, or perhaps more slow to arise, has been the peculiarity and the particularity of the building site as a techno-cultural object. Tellingly, I think even broad-minded reflections on the disciplinarity of construction history have presumed a directionality, beginning with a stipulation of method and then using that method to define the nature of its object. The predictable reluctance, though, of the object to always fit the method is then answered with the further expansions of methodological betweenness, as in, quote, construction history is both technological history and cultural history, end quote. I'm not saying that's wrong as a matter of disciplinary constitution. Rather, I've found myself prompted to ask, though, whether there are other approaches that would not be so uncomfortable with the excesses of the building site, with the aspects of building sites that are indifferent to concerns of method, aspects of building sites that are irrecoverable through the lenses of technological or cultural history. Summerson really was quite near the mark when he said it is the history of a complicated process always in a state of change. If the building site is where this complicated process came into presence at one time, then it is to the building site that the architectural historian should return. But how exactly? How does the architectural historian, or any historian, return to the lost building site? You're likely familiar with this image, having encountered it in a class or a textbook, the primitive hut, as represented in the drawing by Charles Eisen, used as the frontispiece of the second edition of Logier's essay on architecture. It has come to be presented as one of the foundation stones of Western architectural theory that developed from the Enlightenment onward. In the image, architecture arises from its natural environment. Some labor has been undertaken, branches cut and laid into place as beams and rafters, but it is hardly noticed within the presence of the hut as a whole. The undisturbed trunks, the canopies of leaves, this is a building without a building site. There is another illustration that portrays Logier's primitive hut quite differently. The pirated English translation of the essay on architecture, published nearly simultaneously with the first French edition, included a frontispiece drawn by Samuel Whale. Here, rather than a building without a building site, the primitive hut is a building as a building site. The 4 tree columns still emphasize the natural origins of architecture, but no longer in unadulterated form. The physical labor, the use of tools, the movement of water and wood and reeds, all these are evidence of Summerson's complicated process, and all propose the construction of architecture as the origin of architecture. That this second frontispiece did not gain a subsequent role in the development of Western architectural theory is due to many contingencies, but it's not the causes of its disappearance I'm concerned with, it's the consequence. The English frontispiece was unknown, or at least certainly ignored until fairly recently, but it is before us now, and yet it has not played a role in fashioning architectural thought like its vastly more influential pair. This unequal lineage conveys quite vividly, I think, how post-Enlightenment Western architectural theory is bound up with the displacement of building sites. A displacement which Logier himself earnestly desired, by the way, in his disparagement of building sites as, quote, confused heaps of troublesome rubbish, heaps of shapeless materials, dangerous scaffolds, a frightful game of machines, a multitude of ragged laborers, end quote. There is something important that these two differently valued images bring into view in considering how the architectural historian and the architect return to the building site. Both are, of course, speculative imaginings used to illustrate summarily an architectural text. Therefore, neither one depicts a condition of fact or experience. But take a moment to consider what each reveals, or what each might reveal, about the historical presence of a building site. The whale image offers more, surely, and we could be tempted to risk Logier's disdain and look at the tools in use, the axe, the ladder, the jar, and to categorize these as kind of evidence of tools that might have existed within the illustrator's experience. We could look at the hewn lumber and the thatch and categorize these too as evidence, not of the origins of architecture, but of the history of building practice, to recall Summerson's words. But then just as distinctly, the idealized figures in their highly conventional poses, the artistic renderings of light and shading, perhaps most of all, the linear hatchings of the engraving lines, those remind us that we are not looking at a building site. We're looking at an act of imagination, and we're looking at it through a specific medium. Any return to the building site is refracted by the media that enable that re-encounter. And a media history of the building site would suggest at the very start the need to inquire into the specifics of this mediated refraction and its consequences. I want to propose here that we should consider the media of re-encounter in 2 distinct registers. The first is technical, that familiar register of media as filtering reality through some prism of technical arrangements. In the case of the Samuel Whale drawing, for example, we would have to admit that as much as the image might appear to reveal the building site, the medium of engraving actually obscures the reality of the building site, as the different materials of wood, plaster, and water all appear identically as a pattern of alternating light and dark parallel lines. From the engraving, we cannot know what is plaster, what is water, what is wood. We can only impose our prior expectations to arrange those elements. In addition to this first register of refraction, the technical register, there's a second important register of media, what I would call disposition, specifically the disposition of a given media when engaged within the context of building practice and architectural discourse. What I mean by disposition is that the medium, when deployed, has an affinity to latent presumptions about hierarchy or direction or purposiveness that are already present in aesthetic discourse and in architectural discourse specifically. These latent dispositions, these latent presumptions organize these discourses, and in turn, media, when they are employed, are disposed in coordination with the discursive organization. Let me try to clarify what I mean by that through further examples of mediated returns to the building site. Among the entries in D'Alembert and Diderot's famous 18th century encyclopedia are several pertaining to architecture and construction. Some of these entries present a view of building sites in order to illustrate the techniques and practices of building trades like masonry and carpentry. Here again, the technical register of media stands between the historian and the information conveyed by these fictive building sites. Engraving and its effect upon the rendering of materiality are aspects of this technical register, but there's also the book as a technical medium with a size, a scale, a durability of information. These two manifest the technical register. But it's that second register, the disposition, that I want to elaborate. The book is obviously an encyclopedia, a technique of classification that, for all it was influenced in its compilation by Francis Bacon's inductive reasoning, was offered to its reader as a deductive schema. In these plates, the activity of building is understood as a rational whole, constituted by subordinate parts, staged through an accumulative process whereby the individual actions of chiseling, lifting, mixing, or setting are subordinated to the coherence of the object they will produce, which in turn is then the evidence of a practice called masonry. The disposition of the medium here is deductive, and it is a disposition that refracts the historical return to the building site as much as the techniques of engraving or the book. Because the building site is placed in advance within a larger structure of meaning, explicitly for Diderot, a tree of knowledge, where masonry, statics, architecture, indeed engraving, all have their assigned places in a hierarchy. To re-encounter the building site through the medium of Diderot's encyclopedia, then, is to concede to this deductive disposition, a concession that places the building site in a determined and very familiar relation to the building as a prelude, as a means, as an instrument. In this one example, the encyclopedia, the dispositional ordering is epistemological, but the dispositions of various media in relationship to building sites vary much more widely. The professionalization of architecture, the industrialization of building, the organization of speculative finance, all of these attributes of 19th century modernity were accompanied by new media of representation, whose subjects included building sites. Follow a rough chronology towards the modern period, and these other dispositions come into view, as do, of course, the new technologies of media. There are, in the archives of the Sir John Soane Museum, dozens of paintings and drawings like this one that depict site conditions during various stages of construction of buildings designed by Soane and his office. These site progress drawings accompany and indicate the rise of professionalism, for which Soane himself was responsible in no small way. As the architect adopted the mantle of professionalism and assumed responsibility for verifying costing and quality of construction, the building site became a place of not only physical action and literal measurements, but also new modes of calculation and prediction. One of the methods for managing this conceptual domain was the documentation of the progress of construction in visual media. The use of these drawings, some are watercolors, some sketches, all executed on the building site, The use varied from communication with Sohn or a patron to instruments of record keeping to pedagogical instruction for apprentices in Sohn's office. Notably, of course, they intend the portrayal of real building sites, not imagined ones like the examples I've shown so far. Considering these drawings in terms of media, they are technological contemporaries of the Laugier and Didier examples. In terms of that first register, the technical, the capacities and limits of their technical aspects include qualities such as portability, accuracy, durability. What is the convenient size of a sketchbook that you would carry between office and building site? What level of detail can you provide in the wash of a watercolor? How susceptible are such paper images to damage as they are handled? Questions such as these reveal specificities of mediation that need to be considered in accessing the information these site progress drawings convey about the building site. Even more significant, though, is the dispositional character of this particular medium. That disposition is weighted toward material reality, a substantiveness that makes its cast empirical, inductive. The reason for that cast is that these sketches and watercolors are surrogates for the eye of the architect. They offer assessments of the building site from the professional perspective of the architect. Their measure is correctness. At a given moment in time, do the materials and actions of the building site tend to correspond correctly to an instruction, or do they not? Do they tend toward the correct fulfillment of an architectural intention, or do they not? In other words, these drawings see, in an almost literal sense, see the building site as the carrying out of a plan, a design in the full sense of the word. These media are disposed to document progress. And in that disposition, there's an opening into one understanding of the building sites they portray, but also, crucially, a foreclosure of many other possible understandings of those same building sites. One more example of a visual medium of documentation in the very different technology of photographic media, which was put to use for similar purpose less than half a century after those drawings were made by Sohn's office. Photography, of course, we are accustomed to regard as a technical media of apparatus, chemistry, light, artificial process, technique. So how do those qualities of apparatus affect our return to the building site? Accuracy and precision, of course, are two effects of the photograph's capacity to represent things as they are. This is the actual appearance of the building site, one is tempted to say. But of course, the limitations of the photographic medium are familiar. For several decades, the absence of color, and even subsequently, color is a simulation, the mechanical susceptibility to environment so that the building site is never witnessed in a downpour, the variable depth of field of the apparatus with the illusion of 3 dimensions eliding the real space of the building site, the length of exposure in early techniques requiring the building site to be still rather than active, stationary workers, as you can see here, no machinery in motion. We return to the building site then through the limitations of the medium, not through its possibilities. And again, disposition is important here. The use of photography quite early, in this case in 1857 at the building site of the US Treasury in Washington, suggests an interest in the medium's capacity for documentation. It suggests also the continuation of the practice of supervisory assessment begun earlier in the century. The photograph is, like the sketches that preceded it, surrogate for the architect, who is in turn surrogate for the clients, in this case, civil servants in the US government. These photographs perform a verification of the transient process, preserving in view what will be concealed or removed in the realization of the architectural object. At this historical moment, the middle of the 19th century, liability and insurance had emerged as constitutive factors of modern society, and photographic media frame the building site in precisely those terms. Accompanying this, there is another dimension to the disposition of these photographs, the aesthetic. Aesthetics manifest in both the technical and the dispositional registers, with the technical obviously producing aesthetic potential and the dispositional then charging the aesthetic with value and with meaning. Just as the sketches from Sohn's office adopted conventions, aesthetic conventions of shading, focal centrality, symmetry of frame, these and other photographs of building sites superimpose upon their subject an aesthetic mediation of frame, proportion, or arrangement that is at once the building site and also not the building site. The work of any number of scholars has revealed the relationship of architecture and photography in these terms, but it is specifically the dispositional relation of the building site, not the building, that I want to emphasize. And from photography, visual media carrying up towards the present fascination with webcams turned towards building sites would continue this same dispositional character. But in addition to these visual media, non-visual media also offer us an opportunity as well to return to the building site. Any building site, certainly since the Enlightenment, but even before, might be construed in terms of numbers, measurements, obviously, but also costs. Notebooks and ledgers used alongside photographs to record salient facts of a building site offer a tracing of its ephemeralities. Employing the evidentiary potential of such media, Linda Clark has opened a perspective on the building site through the lens of political economy. More recently, Sarah Stevens's work on the building site on the financialization of 20th century architecture through practices of real estate development shows the building site to be a step not only in architectural realization, but in the realization of profit. The media in that case are pro forma and spreadsheets, and other numeral technologies of accounting. These technologies have their own disposition toward the building site, underwritten by teleology of profit or loss rather than the building itself. But even this disposition, though, is oriented in terms of verification of a prediction. There are media whose disposition aligns to consequences in a slightly different way. Christine Wall and her colleagues have shown testimony to be a potent historical medium of historical return. Her extensive oral history project interviewed laborers and supervisors who worked on the building sites of prominent monuments of post-war Britain, and by doing so follows the effects of the building site not just to the building, but to the workers themselves. For example, Wall's return to the Barbican Center building site, mediated through laborers' recorded voices, reveals that the bush-hammered surfaces that are so often discussed as the aesthetic epitome of the architecture of the Barbican were also the cause of Raynaud syndromes in the hands of the laborers who crafted them. An aesthetic consequence, yes, but also a consequent violence, and therefore an insight that might encourage a different association of workers' bodies and architectural aesthetic than those offered, even with a critical intent, than those offered by way of returns through photographic media. This past spring, I asked a group of seminar students in the MArch program to experiment with modes of representing historical building sites in an effort to pry open some possible modes of return that use the superimposition of multiple media to loosen the command of one or other disposition. The proposals were, I thought, exciting. One returned to the building site of Thoreau's cabin at Walden, here on the left, with a digital annotation of his original text, collapsing book, accounting, encyclopedia, materiality, all into a loose hierarchy of information, a flow of information. Another project returned to a building site in Antarctica, here on the right, with a spreadsheet that can join time and geography in a deliberate mirroring of the disposition of logistics and the differentiated protocols of logistics. A third project approached the speculative development of Queen Square in Bath with nested timelines, one to record the geologic formation of the limestone strata quarried for the building stone, another to measure the very brief durations of the actions employed by quarrymen to extract usable stones. Against both those timelines could then be recorded the abstract time of finance, which was measured both in the decades that measured leases and subleases, and also the hours that were used to calculate the wages of individual laborers. My students' work makes me think that new openings for historical return to the building site are suggested by the digital humanities, with the potential superimposition and conjunction of diverse media. The caution, of course, is that the evidentiary archive will still consist of dispositional media, such as those I described before, drawings and photographs and ledgers. It's not the comprehensiveness of collections or representation that determines the nature of the return, but the parameters of those two crucial registers, again, the technical and the dispositional. Consider now the site diary, the contemporary term for the master instrument used by the architect, client, and contractor to establish what has happened on the building site, when and where and by and to whom. This record, the site diary, became all but indispensable as the modern building site, like so many situations in modernity, was inscribed into the circumstances of risk and liability. It has taken on ever more complex form as a result of its motive towards comprehensiveness, its need to record as many details and eventualities as possible. Current software available to produce and manage site diaries actually resemble already a possible digital humanities model of a building site, combining text, video, sound, messaging, accounting, and so on. But the site diary, though highly complex and excitingly multiple in its media, is of course entirely disposed in the same manner as those drawings from Soane's office, an index of what has or has not gone according to the architect's plan. My basic point here is simple and I think unremarkable. The historian returns to the past through an array of materials that have their own qualities and motivations and capacities. This isn't a revelation, but my argument is that there's a particular pertinence in the case of the building site. And for architectural practice, there's a particular consequence to the absence of building sites within architectural history. Here, the return is not only a matter of navigating the contingencies of different archives, but of wrestling with the entire disposition those archival materials reflect, the disposition of the discipline. That disposition has oriented the architectural perspective resolutely toward a conception of linear process, a set of means arranged toward an end, toward a consequence, the building, whose prelude is simply that, a prelude. The return to the building site within architectural history might, I think, take on a different complexion were this a priori disposition explicitly acknowledged and then set aside or resisted in favor of a kind of lateral history. What I would call a lateral history would see the building site as a moment within other different historical sequences, sequences not so disposed toward the architectural object. The lived experience of labor, perhaps, geographic to regard migrant patterns or socioeconomic to locate patterns of participation, or the flowing of fungible capital into and out of mechanisms of increase, examining transactions of abstraction and materiality. Of course, such histories do exist, largely outside architectural history. And even then, they've scarcely ever been posed in relation specifically to building sites. And particularly now, as we reconstructure our entire conception of our world in terms of scarcity rather than abundance, what might happen, specifically what might happen within architectural education, were architectural history to encounter the building site not as a node along the linear path from architect's concept to patron's satisfaction? That's the question that I want to pose. And while I won't conclude with a definitive answer, I do want to use the remaining 10 minutes, 5 minutes, to put the proposition of lateral history into a broader context of historical returns that have recently surrounded us, progressive and reactionary returns, all prompting a need for historians to consider our habits of historical perspective. In the early 1930s, N.C. Wyeth, father of Andrew Wyeth, painted this imagined scene, building the first White House, as one of a series of patriotic posters commissioned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. The White House is under construction in the background. In the foreground, surveying the work are George Washington and the architect James Hoban, an immigrant, we should note, from Ireland. Wyeth insisted on the figural accuracy and narrative plausibility of his painting. He had studied Hoban's architectural drawings carefully to reproduce the original structure, and he had learned that Washington had made visits to the building site. Quote, "It is a day in early summer 1798, about the time that the slates for the roof were being laid. Mr. Washington stands beside architect Hoban, both intent upon some question concerning the building," end quote. The fiction here in this return to a building site is not as overt as in the Logier frontispieces, but it's nevertheless fully evident as fiction. It's not a historical image, but a political one, with patriotism as its intended affect. The influence of the original poster in that regard seems to have been limited. It was curtailed by the crisis of the Great Depression. But the image made one fleeting reappearance as the official White House Christmas card sent out by Richard Nixon in December 1971. Why did President Nixon choose this as the 1971 White House Christmas card? The image would have had particular resonance, since Nixon had over the preceding 18 months made headway in a deliberate effort to cultivate the support of blue-collar workers with a particular focus on building trades. This effort was instigated by a Department of Labor report on the problem of blue-collar workers, but it was galvanized by a very visible public event in May 1970, an outburst of violence that was immediately named the Hard Hat Riot. The Kent State shootings on May 4th that occurred that year caused an immediate eruption of student protests around the country. Those in New York City centered downtown between Wall Street and City Hall, with anti-war sentiment directed at the corporate class. On May 8th, the large assembly of such protesters had gathered in the plaza in front of Federal Hall. At midday, groups of construction workers flowed toward the site, intent upon a very different political message, delivered vocally and then with violence. Ironworkers, most of them, but pipe fitters and electricians and other trades, all descended down from the steel frames of the many skyscrapers being erected throughout the financial district. Many of them notably arrived from the building site of the World Trade Center, whose twin towers, whose steel skeletons were already a vivid symbol of the city. The hard hats swept into the protesters, punching, kicking, in many instances wielding their tools as weapons. The police were in part unable, in part unwilling to intervene effectively, and an unequal riot ensued as fleeing students were chased through the streets. As the riot subsided and the construction workers returned to their building sites, it had been their lunch hour, the day's events were quickly measured in political terms. The Hard Hat Riot was seen to announce the emergence of a known political force, the blue-collar worker, as a newly conservative constituency. And much was made of the particular labor of that constituency, skilled labor, physically demanding and inherently dangerous. And it was indeed dangerous. Several dozen workers on the World Trade Center building site were killed during its construction. Nixon, already thinking of re-election, embraced this constituency, accommodating its leaders and using its images in an effort to fundamentally alter existing political alignments. The Hard Hat Riot occurred 50 years ago. By now, the political disaffection of blue-collar laborers has become a reflexive trope, such that the riot has recently been presented as a foreshadowing of the present, a warning sign. That has reduced the Hard Hat Riot to metaphor, and in that reduction, the riot is foreclosed to anything other than shallow causal histories. But it was also a historical event, an event that should be addressed as inseparable from those building sites. And conversely, any architectural history of the World Trade Center should address the riot. The Hard Hat Riot solicits an opening into a lateral history that moves outward from the building site, taken as a condensation of social, material, and economic factors, outward toward other questions and other explanations beyond the realization of architecture. Approached as a prompt for architectural investigation, Wyeth's painting lacks many things. Any details of construction are subordinated by the foreground figures, the billowing cloud behind. But it's precisely the lack that is suggestive here, in the most significant absence, which is the absence of the reality of labor. The White House was constructed in part by enslaved laborers, some owned by Hoban himself. And this fact is surely one of the realities of the building site that must be attended to in any historical return. 25 years after the White House cornerstone was laid, just 100 miles away, another cornerstone was laid to commence the building of the campus of the University of Virginia. This too was the work of hundreds of enslaved laborers, elided from canonical architectural historical accounts of an architecture that has since become a central protagonist of many narratives. But a very recent historical return to the original building site of the UVA campus has brought the enslaved laborers into the foreground of attention, and has done so by opening the building site to what I've been referring to as lateral history. The recently completed Memorial to Enslaved Laborers creates in material form a historical recognition and remembrance of the people whose labor and skill constituted the very possibility of this building site. But crucially, the memorial and the historical project that brought it to fruition and that continues on does not render these laborers as a means for the process undertaken toward its end, the university campus. Their presence and their labor was indispensable to that, certainly, but the memorial project does not make the mistake of construing indispensability as the sum of value. In other words, where a historical view of the building site that privileges architectural process might presume that to acknowledge the indispensability of these laborers is appropriate recognition, the memorial project moves laterally from the building site, placing these laborers not only in the context of their work, but also in parallel contexts of personhood, of place, trajectories of community ebb and flow. The memorial to enslaved laborers arose from the collaborative efforts of many persons. Professor Mabel Wilson of Columbia and other historical researchers restored the names, the occupations, the relations of many dozens of the enslaved laborers, and established, if not the identities, then valuably the presence of many dozens more. This historical perspective places these individuals into a societal framework. They're not reduced to laborers on a building site, but are persons within a full network of relationships, artisanal, familial, communal, that extends, again, because of and through the lateral history of the memorial project, forward up to our present moment. Indeed, a visitor now to the memorial participates in the original building site through the affective relation that has been produced by the historical research and by the memorial's design. The lateral movement from the building site alters not just the scope, but also the orientation of architectural understanding of the Jeffersonian campus. In short, thinking about Wyeth's painting can bring us to two very different building sites, each clouded in an actuality of violence. The implacable violence of assault, the indifferent violence of industrial accident and job site death, the unpardonable violence of enslavement. And each site also clouded then in a politics arising from or against or as reparation for that violence. To see into these circumstances require, though, that the building not be assumed to be the protagonist of events, but rather the building site to be that protagonist. This then is my proposition. Architectural history, and thus the discipline, should no longer regard the building site as a performance of architectural intention, should no longer regard the building site with casual interest, like passersby wondering when the building will be finished. Architectural history should instead consider the other example set by the most serious members of the Sidewalk Superintendents Club, a willingness to accept that once the building gets built, there is little left to see, and it's time to move on to, or to return to, another building site. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Timothy. That was wonderful, amazing. It's radical proposal in your last summing up, that we move from the intentions, the end object, is the end point, object oriented, whether it be through architectural intentions or through architectural history, to a lateral relational set of around the site itself. Thank you. Now we do have some questions. I have some questions. Joseph probably has questions, and we had one immediately when you were speaking from Christy Anderson. And I'm wondering, Joseph, what do you think if we just ask that one because it was in the midst before we start with our own questions?
Sure, it's a very good question. Shall I read it out?
Yes, thank you.
So Professor Christy Anderson asks, Timothy, if you could say a bit more about the building site as a porous space. You said a bit about this at the beginning with the role of the spectators on the sidewalk, but she notes that clearly part of the interest in the building site is that it was a porous space that draws on a variety of different kinds of expertise of the workers, for example. And she points out that the building site also links to specific other sites, environmental spaces like forests and quarries, and wonders if it's productive to think about the building site in its linkages with sites of experimentation, laboratories, for example, or even libraries as sites for the exchange of knowledge.
Yes, great. Thank you, Professor Anderson, Christy, for that. Nice to hear from you or see you kind of in mediated form. Yes, absolutely. The kind of that sort of expansion, I think, is highly productive. Is a kind of key recognition of both the what is so compelling about building sites and also what is so difficult about building sites as objects for us to recuperate. Meaning that as you suggest, the porosity, the inherent porosity of the building site is constituted by a set of myriad connections, right, to the specific environment, to more distant environments, to sources, to locations of extraction, but also to areas, places, spaces where techniques are developed, where knowledge is developed that is then placed in the building site. It connects as well to food networks and where the laborers get their food, what they eat while they're sitting up on in the famous photograph of steel workers sitting at the top of a skyscraper in New York and having lunch. But what I want to recognize in that is two things. In saying first, yes, that porosity I think should be pursued, but two things to consider. One is first, and I'm trying to highlight this, is the difficulty of that. Meaning, how do we reconstitute, especially the ephemeral connection, the more ephemeral connections of that vanished network of elements, and how do we do that reconnection? This is the second point, without either creating or imposing a kind of artificial hierarchies on them. For example, seeing the production of knowledge in laboratories as the kind of key instrument of a building site, rather than perhaps, and I know this isn't what you're saying, but I'm imagining sort of the kind of historical pitfalls that we could find ourselves in, seeing the knowledge production in the lab and weighing that in a sort of hierarchy against sort of informal training of a laborer who's not an apprentice, but simply kind of gains the ability to do the work over time. How do we evaluate those two things, given that the knowledge production within the lab will have a record and archive that is significantly more substantial than the recorded memory of an individual laborer who was not him or herself an apprentice at any time, perhaps was not a member in a union and therefore did not go through a union training. So how do we talk about the knowledge, the embodied knowledge of that actor, that agent on the building site in relationship to that of the lab? Certainly these things are possible and we should do them and pursue them. But what I'm trying to underscore is the need to constantly sort of work back against our own conventions, conventions within architectural history, but severely, I think, conventions within architectural practice that from the professionalization of architecture has really created and kind of constituted these very rigid sort of hierarchical conceptions that are then imposed upon that building site. So to see these arrangements in somehow more horizontally in order to pursue exactly that porosity, but to pursue that porosity with a horizontal measure of judgment, I guess is the way I would describe it.
I wonder if I could push you a little bit or press you a little on that, because when I hear relational and lateral, and I'm thinking of methodology associated with, say, Bruno Latour or media theory, and we sometimes think of it as constellations that, kind of a horizontal, and the pieces, there's many nodes that are in relationship. And then how do you choose? You have to, as you say, overcome your own bias or the perspective of history, how you've been doing history, thinking about it. But then how do you choose which ones? Is it a particular moment, the story you're telling? Or can we think of other ways of, so I'm thinking of writing, we publish, and it has to be a line and chapters, etc. You're working on a book manuscript, I see here, right? So how do you then do it with it? Do you have the choices? You acknowledge the choices for a particular aspect, or is there some way that we could enliven it with the digital humanities and think that you have live aspects that are interacting, you have text parts that are interacting with another kind of public, the word and the others. I'm really personally very interested in this. I've been trying to work with a website for one part and then other part that's published. This is probably in line with the question that some of our PhD students are asking on method too. So bundled up there.
Yes, great, super. So the methods or the theoretical frameworks that you mentioned at the start, Latour, media theory, thinking in terms of constellation, assemblage. I think all of those are the tools, and kind of are the right theoretical tools, not one or other. Like, so it's not to endorse Latour and everything with ANT, but to draw from that, to think through media theory, to think about these different theoretical models, which for the most part have tried to deprivilege objects and to privilege instead, or to bring into view networks, so that those would be the right tools. Within the specifics, though, then of how to kind of pursue this and do the work and not let's say fall into the kind of rigidities. I do think that in large part it is project specific, in the sense that I think that you begin the historical project and the selection or appropriations of methods with some sense of purpose of what it is you're trying to bring into view. And I would point to here, using again the example of the memorial to enslaved laborers. The purpose there is not to sort of say something more about the buildings on campus, right? You're not returning to the building site also to say, how skilled were the carpenters. The initial purpose is the restoration of personhood, right? Is trying to actually restore personhood. What's fascinating to me and compelling to me about the project is that the building site becomes the vehicle for the restoration of personhood. So it's not to say, hey, let's learn more about Jefferson's campus as an architecture. It's to say, let's use the building site as a way to carry out a historical project of the restoration of personhood. And then the building site turns out to be the absolute necessary device to do that, to create this conjunction of a particular skill, a technical role, a participation in a social project, and personhood as a member of a family unit, a member of a community, and so forth. And then I think using that project as well, that what you're pointing to, the actual representation of that kind of new understanding of the building site is the crucial step and the difficult step. And I do think that the digital humanities, just taking that very broadly, and it's not something I have fluency in, so I'm using that in a very colloquial way. The digital humanities would be a vehicle to allow for different valences to sort of coexist around the same object, that I can imagine, and I think that the UVA project does this, that the memorial does not in turn sort of erase the campus, the physical, the arrangements of the campus, the idea of the campus, the concepts of it. It does supplement them, but it also doesn't sort of privilege them. So that, and it does that by being a physical object. It is actual architecture doing work as architecture. So it doesn't have to be mediated by me and by the historian. You can go to the memorial and I think capture everything that I've described through the architecture itself. But there is also a historical project. There's a website, there's documentation, there's genealogy. And that project was largely pursued initially through a method of genealogy, looking at family relationships in order to reconstitute a kind of missing community. So the digital humanities aspect of that project, I think, is very powerful. And you might contrast it to the Hard Hat Riot, which exists. I mean, there's sort of two kind of records I would point to. One is a book that was just published a few months ago that's fine, but is just a sort of political, a very kind of normative, not surprising political, this is how we got to, the Trump years kind of history. It doesn't really do anything with that event. And then there's a film for a kind of documentary film for which Scorsese has claimed credit because he was teaching the students who actually made the film, that also turns the riot into a kind of aesthetic spectacle in a sort of frame. So I think it is the multiplicity, I'm sorry, I'm skewing away a bit, but to come back, it's the multiplicity and overlapping of method that I think is the crucial experiment anyway to be undertaken. So it would not be the book, or could not only be the book at this point. It definitely can be actual architectural objects that can do this historical work, but not by themselves.
We have several people sent in questions at precisely the same moment, so I'm going to just go through them in an arbitrary order. We actually have this lecture is taking place hosted by the Daniels art faculty, but we also have a number of art historians here who work on early modern or pre-modern architecture. And we have a question from Amalia Feldman about how you understand the significance of the building site in relation to the availability of documentation, particularly in cases where there is little documentation available about the construction process or the sort of prelude to the finished building. And I mean, does the approach that you're outlining, do you expect that it can help us to think about the construction in a new way?
So I should be clear from the start that I'm a modern architectural historian. So I've been talking and trying to engage with colleagues who work on early modern periods, different geographies, to understand very much the difference in record, the difference in the actual formulations of building sites at these different times. So I have a lot of ignorance around the topic, and I want to be clear about that. However, the broad answer the broad response I would give is, I think that in the cases where there is not significant layers of documentation of a given building site, what that actually could help us recognize is that we can talk about building sites plural without necessarily being fixated on a building site as the sort of historical solution, explanation of something. And I see this actually as a kind of parallel to, and maybe a sort of profitable way of moving, of slightly displacing this, what I'm emphasizing as a kind of teleology within the discipline of there's a plan, there's an action, and there's a result. And we think of that as an inviolable sequence. I'm asking us to think instead about that middle action, the building site, from the point of view of other sequences. The example I often give is, if you think of a carpenter and try to see the building site from the perspective of any given carpenter, workman, it's one of many dozens of building sites. The constitution of a specific building is much less relevant than the repetition of a certain set of skills that lead to the payment of wages that allow for the support of family. So you might imagine that on any given work site, the importance of a building site to a given laborer is what it actually enables, not in terms of realizing the building, but what it enables in terms of their life. So to think of perhaps the early modern building site, what I would ask is whether, and this is a kind of question for my early modern, my colleagues who specialize in early modern, whether rather than looking at a given building site and trying to map it to the building, whether we can use what little fragile documentation there is around building sites to look actually laterally at many building sites and to reconstruct not the trajectory towards building, but the habits of certain lives that were invested in building. in the practice of building. So to understand the lives of tradesmen, to understand the quarry workers, to understand why certain cities and supplies arrange themselves around a building site. So people producing food for a given building site when the population of a city swelled because of a building site there, things like that. Can we actually ask within architectural history slightly different questions by not privileging that link between the building site as an action and the building as a result of the action?
Your answer there, Timothy, brought to mind Leon Battista Alberti's famous remark that a carpenter is but an instrument in the hands of the architect, which
Right.
is sort of the attitude of architectural history that you have been criticizing.
Yeah.
So we're at time and we sometimes get abruptly thrown out, but let's try Jason. Can we get Jason's question in there? But you might get cut off. This might happen. Well, so Jason, do you want to ask directly or should
Sure.
we? Yeah.
Sure, I have a multiple screen thing going on, so I'll try to actually look at where my camera is. First off, thank you very much, Timothy. It was super fascinating. And as we were speaking there at the end, I was thinking a little bit that your approach seems to offer a way to also think about questions of renovation and refurbishment within this larger framework, which, for people who work on early modern materials, sometimes grappling with renovation as kind of often seen as a challenge. But at any rate, I guess this is a question that I certainly know that you have thoughts on. And speaking about just kind of construction law and codes and customs that govern construction, I guess could you speak to the function of codes and customs in your theorization of construction and the construction site? How might the legal structures, whether forms of authority, political or otherwise, that govern labor, property, behavior, regulation, time, et cetera, work with or against the effort to consider a lateral history? So I'm thinking do these kind of construction laws, does this reinsert this kind of vertical sense of authority within this kind of lateral framework? And how would you grapple with that by kind of promoting this kind of lateral way of kind of theorization?
That's a great question. Thanks, Jason. Nice to see you. The legal dimension is absolutely crucial and fascinating particularly as a kind of engagement between the materiality of the building site and these abstract registers, right, of law, but also of finance. And there are certainly examples or aspects of law that do seem to be about a kind of rigid, almost rigid codifications of the object, and those would be things, certainly things like property law. So the designation of plats and the way those are structured, zoning code and the way those produce a very direct link to the architectural object. So if I look at the building site through plat and zoning code and so forth, then I'm really thinking about the architectural object. But there are other regimens of law that actually move us, that in a sense don't care about the architectural object as part of the building site. And those are quite interesting. So the most obvious example would be health and safety laws. So the laws that manage behavior on a building site to minimize risk, to minimize death. And these obviously these laws kind of rise and increase over the course of the 20th century and become actually really a key, almost overwhelming dimension of the building site by the later 20th century. When you think, as you go by building sites now and you see, 100 days since the last accident is prominently displayed, that's part of this legal armature. And it has nothing to do with the building as an object. It has everything to do with the building site as an action, as something that is being undertaken, that is dealing with bodies and is dealing with individual lives. And so when you think of that, you think of workers' compensation laws and things like that, those I think are the key legal regimens that would move us horizontally, that would move us outward from the building site into society without any real regard for whether we're talking about architect A built design or architect B's design, right? The laws are still going to function from the building site outward. And I think there are others around environment as well. Not only the environmental performance of the building, but things like disposal of building site debris and the increasingly rigid measuring and control of that could be interesting ways to look at the building site as a participant in these sort of larger social frameworks under legal control. So what can you dispose? When can you drive trucks to the building site, for example, right? Like that's rigidly controlled in many cities because of environmental concerns, acoustic living environment, but also, you know, living environment in terms of pollution and so forth. I should mention, maybe just because it links, I think that it's maybe of interest that just this morning that Lacaton and Vassell were the winners of the Pritzker Prize, right? The architectural practice that is so focused upon the idea of renovation, reuse, of taking seeing the building as a set of material procedures and transformations, and not thinking of it as an object, you know, that has a finished form. Like they're a practice that has emphasized the idea of process, making, unmaking, remaking, unmaking, remaking. So perhaps there's something, you know, timely anyway for me. It's a big day for them, but maybe it's also a timely day for me to hear that news.
Thank you so much, Timothy. This has been an incredibly rich lecture and wonderful questions. We haven't gotten to all the questions, and I have a whole list of additional questions, but we have to wrap it up. Unfortunately, we're over time already. Mary Lou, I sorry to cut you off. Do you want to close us out?
I like the proposition. I was just going to say the proposition of environmental, because when you remove toxic stuff, we've all been architects, right? You work on where do they take it and where is it dumped? And like that is the most fascinating thing about what town then has to deal with it. In Toronto, it's Maple, north of Toronto, where a lot of the creosote and toxic stuff is. And that'd be a great way to go at an architectural history, but is environment and site-based. So thank you. We really do. They've been really good keeping us on longer, but this is so fascinating. I'm so glad that you agreed to come in to present, come virtually and to present this. And it's been really wonderful. Thank you so much. Did you have any wrap up thank yous? I then have to move on to say something about the next lecture, but
yes,
anyone?
Just thank you all so much for the invitation to speak. This has been great, and for these questions. I'll hear more over time, I'm sure, from various of you, but I appreciate absolutely the attention and the chance to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So great. Our next lecture then, I believe I don't have my base right here, March 26th with Douglas Cardinal, who
March
is
25th.
25th, sorry.
Yes.
Douglas Cardinal, okay. The Garrett Chair holder for this year. So we have a lot of thank yous here for you, Timothy. Great. And I see a lot of my students from ARC 451. Thank you. All right. Bye, everyone.